The ride from the hospital felt longer than the 15 days I had spent inside it. My hip throbbed with every bump in the road, but the heavier ache sat in my chest. I had imagined the moment of release countless times, Dorian waiting with a jacket over his arm, Esmeré's careful smile, perhaps even a small bouquet of flowers to soften the sting of those sterile walls. None of that happened. I had signed my own discharge papers, carried my own bag, and hailed a taxi with trembling hands. The driver barely spoke, and I was grateful. I needed the silence. It gave me time to cradle the hope that maybe my son had been too busy, maybe Esmeré too preoccupied with work, or my granddaughter. Families stumble. Excuses are easy to invent when you want to believe. I wanted desperately to believe. When the taxi turned onto Agua Fria Street, the air felt sharper, charged in a way that unsettled me. I leaned closer to the window, expecting the comfort of home, my adobe walls and the rose bushes Guillermo and I had planted years before. Instead, I saw a line of cars crammed against the curb. Sleek black SUVs, a bright red truck, even a sedan with out-of-state plates. None belonged to my neighbors. Music drifted through the open evening air, a beat too loud, too careless for the quiet street. Laughter rolled out from my backyard, deep male voices, mixed with shrill giggles. I clutched the handle of my bag as the taxi slowed before the familiar green gate. It stood wide open, as though inviting the world to pour into what had once been my sanctuary. The driver asked if he should pull into the drive. My voice caught, but I managed to say no. I wanted a moment to understand before stepping onto the gravel path. I pushed a few bills into his hand, slid out of the car, and steadied myself against the door. I had returned after 15 days of silence, but the sound that greeted me was not welcome. It was the sound of strangers celebrating on my land, and I was about to find out why. I gripped the iron gate and steadied my steps toward the front door. The music grew louder, the voices more careless, as if the house no longer held memory or meaning. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Esmeré filled the frame, her arms crossed her smile, cold and precise. "You can't come in," she said, her tone sweetened with false politeness. Then, without blinking, she added, "My parents live here now." The words struck harder than any physical blow. I stared past her shoulder into the living room that Guillermo and I had built together, and it was unrecognizable. Ramiro, her father, stood by the mantel with a wine glass lifted high, laughing as if he had purchased the walls themselves. Beatrice? Her mother dragged my oak side table across the floor, repositioning it as though it were her own. The scrape of wood against tile sent a chill through me. Outside the garage, I noticed cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly. Black marker scrawled on the sides spelled out my initials LM. Every piece of my life quilt's photo albums. Kitchenware had been shoved into those boxes like unwanted clutter. I searched for Dorian, praying he would appear, that he would undo this madness. He stood near the staircase, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the floor. The son who once brought me wildflowers from the arroyo couldn't lift his eyes to meet mine. That silence hurt more than Esmeré's words. I drew a long breath, steadying the tremor in my chest. I could have screamed, could have begged him to remember who I was. Instead, I let the stillness inside me grow, wrapping itself around my fury. "Enjoy while you can," I whispered, low but firm. Esmeré blinked, perhaps confused that I did not collapse at her pronouncement. I turned away before she could answer, leaving my boxes behind, carrying only the weight of what I now knew. At the motel that night, I dialed a number I hadn't called in months, knowing Teresa would pick up. The motel smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, but the lock clicked solidly behind me, and that was enough. I set my hospital bag on the chair and lowered myself onto the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under the weight of my exhaustion. My hands shook, as I pulled out my phone. Only one name came to mind. "Teresa," I said, when she answered my voice, frayed. "I need you." She didn't hesitate. "Tell me where you are." Within an hour, she arrived carrying the same battered briefcase she had used since law school. We had met decades ago, two young mothers trading recipes and babysitting shifts. She had become a lawyer out of stubbornness, fueled by the memory of watching her own mother lose a condo to forged papers. I could see the old fire in her eyes when I told her what Esmeré had said. We spread my records across the small desk by the window. Folders marked with Guillermo's handwriting, a fireproof envelope of deeds, and a battered binder with my trust documents. Teresa's fingers moved quickly, scanning dates and signatures. "Your trust should have kept the house safe," she murmured. "But these transfers, look." On a printout of my bank alerts, several large sums had been siphoned in recent weeks to a name I didn't recognize. Calder Redev, LLC. My stomach tightened, as if the words themselves were a knot. Teresa leaned back, jaw tight. "This reeks of a power of attorney. Did you sign anything at the hospital?" I closed my eyes, remembering Esmeré's gentle voice, her insistence that I sign what she called insurance papers. I had been so tired, barely able to lift a pen. Teresa tapped the paper. "That's how they did it. They used your son's desperation and your weakness to steal." I pressed my hand against the folder, steadying myself. Teresa's voice was steady, almost fierce. "If they want to play with signatures, we'll answer with every receipt you've ever kept." And in that motel room surrounded by paper and memory, we began to plan how to take my house back. The next morning, Teresa drove me to the precinct on St. Francis Drive. The building was plain, sun-bleached stucco, but stepping inside felt heavier than any courtroom I had ever entered. Sergeant Marisol Ortega met us in a narrow office lined with case files. She listened as Teresa explained the transfers. The forged signatures, the possibility of a power of attorney, slipped under my hand in a hospital bed. Ortega didn't interrupt, just scribbled notes in her steady handwriting. When Teresa finished, Ortega looked at me. "I understand the urge to confront them, but if you push now, you risk losing the proof we need. They'll deny everything, say you're confused after surgery. What matters is evidence that speaks louder than emotion." Her words stung because I had already tried to storm through the door with nothing but fury. I nodded, swallowing the burn in my throat. Teresa laid out the plan. She would file requests with the county recorder to pull any filings against my property. She would also subpoena the bank records that tied Calder Redev LLC to the withdrawals. My role would be more dangerous, to walk back into my own house act, composed, and let the Calders reveal themselves. Ortega slid a small velvet pouch across the desk. Inside was a thin silver bracelet, simple enough to pass as jewelry. At its clasp, almost invisible, was a tiny button. One press and it records. Another press sends a silent signal straight here. I clasped it onto my wrist, the cool metal against my skin, steadier than my own pulse. For the first time in days, I felt something stronger than grief, a sharp thread of resolve. That evening in the motel, I practiced breathing evenly, rehearsing a smile that didn't show rage. Rage wouldn't win this. Precision would. By the time the sun dipped behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, I knew what I had to do. I would walk back into that house not as a victim, but as a witness. I waited until the music carried across the street again. It was the same careless laughter, the same thumping bass that had greeted me when I first returned from the hospital. This time, though, I did not walk in blind. I adjusted the silver bracelet on my wrist, pressed the clasp once, and stepped through the open gate. Inside, the Calders had turned my home into their stage. Balloons bobbed near the ceiling. Wine bottles cluttered my dining table. Ramiro leaned against the mantel, a glass raised high as if the house itself had crowned him king. His voice boomed, carrying to every corner. It's simple. You find an owner too weak to fight, push the papers through, and the county barely blinks. Fast-tracked, signed, stamped hours before they know it. Laughter erupted sharp and ugly. I stayed near the hallway, my pulse hammering the bracelet, blinking faintly under my sleeve. Beatrice strolled past with a plate of hors d'oeuvres and smirked toward the garage. She won't even know where to sleep once we finish clearing it out. The words struck like a slap, but I forced my breath steady. Then Esmeré's voice cut through casual confident. Her meds are in our primary bedroom. I'll grab them later. As if she had always belonged there, as if I never had. The recorder caught every syllable. I turned slightly enough to glimpse my living room without being noticed. Papers littered the coffee table, contracts, manila folders, even envelopes stamped by the county recorder's office. Ramiro shuffled through them, carelessly bragging to a guest about another parcel on Agua Fria that would soon be theirs. I pressed the second button. The signal went out, invisible and silent. Minutes later, the noise of sirens bled into the music. Doors slammed outside. Sergeant Ortega and 2 officers entered with firm steps, Teresa at their side, holding a warrant. The laughter faltered. Ramiro's hand froze over his glass. Beatrice stiffened eyes darting to the hallway where I stood. Esmeré tried to gather the papers, but an officer blocked her. Devices were bagged, documents seized. The party ended, not with a toast, but with silence heavy enough to crack the walls. I stepped back into the night air, the bracelet warm against my wrist, knowing the real battle was only beginning. The day after the raid, Teresa spread a stack of documents across the motel desk. They weren't just mine. Deeds from houses all along Agua Fria Street, some already transferred, others in process. Ramiro's company name appeared again and again, tied to contracts and wire transfers. They're not after only your house, Teresa said, her voice tight. They're buying up the neighborhood. Once the rezoning goes through, the land value will multiply. I stared at the names on the deed's widows. I had shared coffee with veterans who still waved from porches. Couples who had lived here longer than I had. Each signature looked uneven, hurried, some barely legible. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just me they had marked, it was everyone too tired or too trusting to fight. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Ortega called me into her office. A nurse from the hospital had come forward. She remembered Esmeré standing close during Dorian's sedation, whispering that papers needed signing. My mind burned with the memory of Esmeré's soft insistence, her smile masking the steel beneath. When Ortega slid the report across the desk, I felt the room tilt. My son's name was there, his signature shaky but clear, granting power to Esmeré and Ramiro's company. Did he know? I asked, though. The answer already pulsed inside me. Ortega's silence was heavier than words. I walked outside into the sharp New Mexico sunlight, the report trembling in my hands. Images of Dorian as a boy filled my mind, his laughter in the arroyo, the nights he pressed wildflowers into my palms. That same boy had stood mute while my life was stripped from me. Had he believed it would all work out? Or had he chosen not to care as long as someone else carried the blame? The betrayal sliced deeper than any forged paper. My fury toward the Calders was clean, almost easy. But the ache for Dorian was different. Messy, endless, like a wound that refused to close. That night in the motel, I laid the report beside my bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing that when the time came, I would have to face my son, not just his wife's schemes. The notary sat across from Ortega, her hands trembling as she confessed. She admitted she had stamped documents without Dorian present, pressured by Ramiro's promises of more business. Her words sealed what Teresa had already pieced together. The Calders had orchestrated every step. That evening, Ortega moved quickly. Warrants were issued, and the air around the precinct shifted from suspicion to certainty. I watched from a corner of the room as Ramiro was led in, his swagger gone, his wine-slick grin replaced by silence. Beatrice followed, her arms folded tightly, eyes darting everywhere except at me. Esmeralda came last, her chin high, still clinging to the arrogance that had poisoned my home. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Each charge fell like a stone into the room. But my eyes searched only for one face. Dorian arrived separately, not in cuffs, but pale, slumped, his shoulders rounded as though the weight of everything pressed him into himself. Ortega gave him space, letting him speak without force. His voice cracked when he finally admitted what he had done. He had signed the power of attorney desperate to cover debts from failed real estate flips. "I thought I could fix it later," he whispered, eyes fixed on the table. The words sank into me, heavier than any betrayal from the Calders. They had schemed out of greed, but my son had handed them the knife. He had believed lies because they offered escape from his own mistakes. I wanted to shout, to shake him, to demand why he hadn't come to me. Instead, I stood in silence, my hands clenched at my sides. His shame was already a prison, and I could see he had no way out. But truth. As Ortega noted his statement, I knew this reckoning was only the beginning. The real choice lay ahead between justice and blood. They allowed me a few minutes with Dorian in a small consultation room, nothing more than a table, 2 chairs, and the hum of fluorescent lights. He looked smaller than I remembered, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes swollen from nights without rest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I reached into my bag and slid a yellowed envelope across the table. "Your father wrote this before he passed," I said, my voice steady. "I think it's time you read it." Dorian's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. His eyes moved over Guillermo's handwriting, the words that had anchored our family. A reminder that character is proven when no one is watching, that fear and greed are traps, that integrity is the only inheritance worth leaving. As he read, his shoulders shook. Tears dropped onto the page, smudging the ink. "I destroyed everything," he whispered. "I let them use me. I let them use you. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. It's the least I can do." I wanted to reach for him, but the memory of standing at my own door, barred from entering, held me back. Love pulled in one direction, pain in another. I steadied myself and spoke carefully. "Testify. Accept what comes. Serve your time if that's what the court decides. Then and only then can you begin again. I will not carry your punishment for you." His eyes met mine, desperate for absolution. I didn't offer it. Not yet. What I offered was the chance for him to reclaim his own dignity if he had the courage to bear the weight of his choices. When the guard opened the door, Dorian pressed the letter to his chest like a lifeline. I turned away, knowing that my strength no longer came from protecting him, but from reclaiming myself. The courtroom was hushed when Esmeralda took the stand. She carried herself with the same smirk she had worn at my doorway, certain she would talk her way free. But when the audio played, the clipped arrogance of her voice, claiming my home, mocking my belongings, her composure cracked. She gripped the rail, her face draining of color, and folded in on herself as the words echoed through the chamber. Ramiro and Beatrice did not even attempt the performance. Both accepted plea deals once the stack of deeds and bank transfers was laid bare. Their empire of signatures crumbled into evidence bags and court exhibits. Dorian sat across from me, shoulders drawn, but voice steady. He admitted the debts, the desperate choices, the signatures he should never have given. He told the court he had been weak, manipulated, and blind to the harm he caused. It was not absolution, but it was truth. The judge granted him a reduced sentence, community service, financial counseling, and supervision. It was mercy, but it came with weight he would have to carry himself. When the ruling came, The judge upheld the trust Guillermo and I had built years ago. The house was still mine, safeguarded by the foresight I once thought unnecessary. Relief washed through me, tempered by sorrow that it had come to this. Afterward, neighbors gathered outside the courthouse. They clasped my hands, thanking me for shining a light on the fraud that had nearly consumed them as well. Their gratitude warmed me, yet my heart remained heavy. Justice had been served. But my son's absence beside me was a wound the law could not heal. As the crowd thinned, I turned toward home, ready to face the quiet rooms and decide what to rebuild from the ashes. The first day back in my house, I walked slowly through each room, letting the silence settle around me. The walls felt scarred by what they had witnessed, but they were still mine. I opened the boxes the Calders had shoved into the garage and began putting my life back in order. Photos of Guillermo and Dorian as a boy went back onto the mantel quilts, onto the bed. My mother's porcelain bowl into the cabinet. Each piece returned felt like stitching a torn seam. Outside, I knelt by the roses. The soil was dry roots tangled from neglect, but I trimmed carefully, pressing new shoots into the ground. It was a ritual Guillermo and I had shared, and the simple act steadied me. Teresa and I met often at her office, shaping the beginnings of the Mercer Foundation. We filed paperwork, recruited volunteers, and spread the word seniors who faced deceit in their own families or communities would not stand alone. The thought that our pain could become someone else's protection gave me purpose. Dorian's letters arrived once a week. Some were clumsy apologies, others lists of counseling sessions and community projects. I read them all, but wrote back only when his words showed effort, not excuses. I would not make the path easy, but I would leave it open. Peace did not come as triumph. It came as a slow exhale, the knowledge that I had survived and reclaimed what was mine. One evening, after finishing the day's planting, I locked the front door and rested my hand against the wood. "Enjoy while you can," I whispered, not to them, but to myself, because this time the house was quiet, and the peace belonged entirely to me.